It's a great pleasure to introduce you to an opportunity to interview Peter Perinski, author of Bonnie Prince Charlie, His Life, Legend and Family, and to discuss along piece of this book, Professor Edward Corb, formerly of the Professor of British History at the University of Toulouse, and of course Edward is the acknowledged expert in Stuart Court in Exile. Good evening, gentlemen. First question, Peter, and it may seem a little cheeky, but why another book in Bonnie Prince Charlie?
Well, that's, David, very good question. I think the thing that differentiates this book, or at least the thing that I felt when beginning to tackle this subject, was that far too many books on Bonnie Prince Charlie were what I would call Britocentric. It's right, of course, for them to have a very, very good look and a very clear look at the 45 itself. That's absolutely natural. But those works which cover his life tended to have that fading. And yet Charles spent very little time in Britain. He was brought up at a thoroughly British court, but abroad, but that wasn't in Britain. He had a Polish mother. He had French relations. He had connections the length and breadth of Europe. And I felt it was extremely important, not least because his personality seemed to me to be so different to his father's, to set him against this completely pan-European, and if we can call it Brito-Scottish parentage, and yet Polish parentage at the same time. I thought that was extremely important to do. The other thing I think about the book is that I've tried to complete his life. And of course, he dies in 1788. His daughter, Charlotte Stuart, dies just 1 year later. Henry, a few years later, his younger brother, Cardinal Henry. But I did want to finish the story as well. So we see the whole of his life, which, of course, takes us very close to the end of the Royal Stuart line.
That's the entrance. This is the USP of the book, and this European dimension of him. Edward, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, you think is this something that historiography often misses out then?
Oh, I entirely agree with that. I mean, it is essential to place Bonnie Prince Charlie in his European context. And, books very naturally and understandably, as Peter has said, do emphasize, the British connection, and particularly when he's in Scotland. But he's an international figure, and he is the son of a Polish princess. And that I entirely agree with Peter in emphasizing, and it does make this book significantly different from the other many books on Bonnie Prince Charlie.
Yeah, so this is the key, this European dimension, to unlock a more fulsome story of Charles Edward Stuart.
Yes, I think there's another thing, David, as well, which is that slightly earlier books, going back perhaps 20 or 30 years, which covered Charles's life, they didn't have very much to say about Charlotte Stuart, his daughter. They had even less to say about Charlotte's children. And yet Charles's relationship, which blossomed at the very end of his life with his daughter, casts an interesting piece of light on his personality. And therefore, I think it is right to pay her a little bit more attention than has been paid up until now, perhaps.
Right. And I think that's what I found that certainly the family, the legacy part is really very interesting, and how this continues. And I think, I can see that this gives the book a flavour, a dimension, a direction that you don't see in the usual, run-of-the-mill biography. I'm very struck. It's obviously a richly illustrated volume. I've got a copy here. It's beautifully produced. But what struck me is that this is not just a history book that's been illustrated. It's clear that the illustrations of some over 70 portraits, about 168 illustrations in the book altogether, these are very much woven into the narrative. Was this a conscious decision then, Peter, in terms of the illustration and the visual culture?
Oh yeah, absolutely so. Of course, you can read a book by reading the text. You can read a book by reading the captions underneath the illustrations. And you can do them fairly successfully separately. Just one very quick word about the captions under many of the portraits. Many of them are extremely long. They're little information boxes, if you like, perhaps slightly aimed more at the art historian. but they are to tell the story of several of the very important discoveries that were made recently, regarding which Edward played an enormously important role. So I wanted to show the newly discovered portraits. I've tried to focus on portraits of the Stuarts which are seldom or never seen before. That was one thing. I wanted to also show portraits from various different museums, so in various different countries. So, for example, represented here we've got museums in Scotland, England, France, Italy, but also Poland, even the Western Ukraine. Documents from the Czech Republic are shown as well. I've tried also to show, this book's written in English, so quite obviously it's going to be mainly read by British people, Scottish people, I hope. And those readers won't necessarily be used to seeing the visual elements that relate to the Sobieski family, Charles's mother's family. I wanted very much to show what a splendid palace they had just south of Warsaw, which is called Wilanów. It actually comes from the word Villa Nova, which represents an extremely high level of European culture in its architecture and its design, in its overall artistic achievement as a building. Then I also wanted to show the castle of Żółkiew, which is today in the Western Ukraine, but at the time of the Sobieski family's lives, that was still in actually central Poland at the time. And just to see the scale of that castle, and all of this emphasizes one thing, which is it tells us about the Sobieski family. It tells us about the family of Charles's mother, who had such an important formative influence on him. And it also shows the power and the wealth of that family. And I think that it's very important to show all of these images. On other things, some of the other illustrations, for example, I wanted to show newspaper articles from the time of the 45, so that by looking at those articles, you can actually sort of feel the mood of the moment. You're in touch with the fabric of the 18th century. You're not just reading what the author's written about it. You're actually looking at the press caption of something which occurred at that time. Later in the book, I showed documents. I think it's very important to show a document. You know, I can write about a document, I can quote from it, I can give its source. But if you actually illustrate, especially the important documents, it gives it an immediacy. You see that something really did exist, and that this isn't just a footnote that we can ignore.
It actually struck me that the illustrations, the portraiture, they were like illustrated footnotes. They were extended. They added to the argument. They brought fresh insight. You know, with your Edward, throughout your professional career, as you've looked at the Stuarts, you have looked at portraiture and the portents and the iconography of portraiture. I mean, were there things or aspects of this that you had been unaware of? Were there new angles on portraiture? You know well, I know, but
yes. I mean, the very exciting thing from my point of view is the discovery of these new portraits. And the book is richly illustrated with those new portraits. Let me put that in perspective. 21 years ago, the Scottish National Portrait Gallery put on an exhibition devoted to the King Over the Water. And in that context, I was asked to write a book, not a catalogue of the exhibition, but a book covering all the Stuart portraits. By and large, that book holds good. One or two things I might change, but basically it remains good, but with one exception. And that in these 21 years, we've had the most exciting discoveries of portraits coming up. Sometimes they're portraits we know, but better versions, or the original version. And particularly the one of Bonnie Prince Charlie on the front cover, painted by Rosalba Carriera.
I was going to ask about that. Yes.
A fantastic discovery. I mean, we knew the image, but we only knew the image from inferior copies. And then one or two others of which we had absolutely no idea, and came out of private collections into the sale rooms with an absolute amazing surprise. And the one I would particularly mention there, other than the Rosalba Carriera, is the great portrait of the young James as Prince of Wales by L'Argilière. a magnificent large portrait, which we just simply did not expect to see and had no idea existed. So from my point of view, that's the exciting thing. And with, as Peter said, these nice long captions explaining the significance of each newly discovered Stuart portrait.
I mean, I really have to praise the National Museum of Scotland's publishing arm. As an author, I cannot praise them enough. They allowed me to put these illustrations in the text itself. That increases the cost of the book, but I think the book is extremely low priced. But nevertheless, you end up with a beautiful object. You know, it's so much better when you're reading about something to have that illustration alongside you without having to go to an inset of illustrations in the middle or the back of the book. So by using high quality paper, we've really got wonderful reproductions of, as Edward says, some enormously important portraits that have recently emerged. You know, so I feel you know, really quite humbled by National Museums of Scotland and the fact that, you know, they contributed so much to creating an absolutely beautiful object.
Yeah, the production, the quality of the production values, and Edward picked up, of course, the rather lovely Zalba Carriera on the cover, and I take it we can judge the book by its cover, because there'd be no doubt in your mind this would be the cover for this book. I assume there could be no other image.
And one thing I might add, if I may, is that these portraits are of exceptionally high artistic quality. They're not just recently discovered portrait showing what the Stuarts look like. Well, they do that certainly, but they are of a great artistic quality in their own right. And this reflects the fact that the Stuarts needed to employ and commission portraits from the best painters available, partly to decorate the court in which they were living, so it looked impressive if it was visited by the King of France or the Pope or someone, partly to give them away as diplomatic gifts so they would be well received and hung in other princely palaces. And so that's what I would say. It is the discovery of these things and discovery of portraits of such high artistic quality.
Do we see it? So it is an art history. It's a documentary, you know, a book that intelligently uses the resource, the visual culture, but also it is a piece of art history as well. Peter, can I just turn to the book itself, and you know, what was your target audience? Who are you trying to reach with this? You know, museums, and this is a museum publication, are very concerned about audiences now. Who are you trying to reach with the book that you maybe felt hadn't been reached before, perhaps?
The book is not directed at academics. There are elements in the book which academics will find of some interest, but it's not aimed at them. It's not designed to be a book which is a laborious read. Anything that is very detailed or perhaps of high focus has been put into two appendices, and there are elements of the back. But I took those out of the main text, as indeed I used endnotes rather than footnotes at the bottom of each page, so as not to distract the reader, because I would like this story to be read and appreciated by well-educated people, but not necessarily specialists. I studied art history myself. Edward and I have now go back decades, quite literally, with our extremely frequent conversations about all manner of paintings relating to the last Stuarts. And so I've got a natural sympathy towards people interested in art history. As Edward's pointed out, we're not just speaking about iconography here. We're speaking about the quality of that iconography. It's not just, oh, that's what James looked like. It's, or Charles, oh, what a magnificent painting as a painting as well. And that's why I did have very much in mind that I wanted to set the record clearly straight with regard to, let's say, the provenance of different paintings, or how they arose, or which version this particular illustration is of others. For example, there's a portrait of King James the Eighth, that is to say, and it's by Bell. It's one of 4 that were made by Bell in 1712. And it's important to say, well, explain which one it is that we're showing, why it's important, that it's only just been recently discovered, but also where are the other three and what are they? So I would imagine that the museums that are interested in the iconography that are Stuart's would perhaps keep this book to one side so that they can go to it and use it as a reference book I'm only speaking about the captions of illustrations now, but so they can go to it and use it as a reference book to remind themselves as to, the provenance or the origins or what is this picture by comparison with others that they may know.
Yeah, like a really good resource
I certainly hope that it would be an easy read for a reasonably well-educated person, and I hope that the easiness of that read would allow somebody to quickly acquire knowledge in a pleasant way. And if they want to focus upon specific bits, well, they can read the captions of the illustrations carefully, or possibly go to the appendices.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on now, and maybe one for you, Edward. You're thinking about we've looked at the iconography, we've looked at the portraiture. I want to sort of focus now on the Excel court, of which you're the absolute Diane. And to you, Edward, what characterises the court where Charles was brought up? We're hearing about this international dimension. Why is Britishness not diluted? What nationality were the courtiers that were around Charles as he's growing up as a boy and as a young man?
Well, the first thing to say is the court is very, very cosmopolitan. If we take the year in which he was born, the nationality with the most number of people in the court was the Irish. And then if we go down, Irish, then down to the French, the English, the Scots, the Italians, down to the Germans, and down to the Swiss. I mean, that's an interesting mixture, the year Charles is actually born. Now, as the years go by, things change, and the number of English and Scots goes up, the French remain the same, the others go down, the Irish go down, and then the Italians become dominant in the kitchens and in the stables and things like this. So from Charles's point of view, he's surrounded by all these nationalities, and it's very cosmopolitan. Then we say, well, what about his own personal servants? The ones he actually sort of lived with. For the first 4 years of his life, he was looked after by women. And those women were all English or Irish. Then when he's 4 years old, he begins to be looked after by men, and they are English, Irish, and French. There's one Scottish gentleman, but on the other hand, the key point is that he has a governor who is a Scot. And this is James Murray, a younger son of Viscount Stormont, created Jacobite Earl of Dunbar. So it's a very, very cosmopolitan court. The Scots are there, but they're not sort of significantly more important than other people numerically, with that single exception of Lord Dunbar.
That's it. So on that's very interesting. So the lingua franca of this court, I mean, did Charles speak English well? Did he speak with an accent? How would he have sounded if I was transported back to the court in exile? What would I have heard?
I wish I knew. I mean, all I can do is speculate. But I mean, he was brought up to be trilingual. He spoke English in the court. He spoke English with his father. Most of the servants, even the Scottish ones, would be speaking English to him, of course. And so would the Irish. He has to learn French because he's got the international language and the French embassy's down the road. And of course, he's got to know Italian. So that I haven't yet got to the accent, have I? He's got these three languages. He must, like all people with language, go from one to another, bring in a foreign word from time to time. What could his English accent be? Because, of course, the English courtiers are coming from different areas of England with strong regional accents. His tutor comes from York, for example. I mean, does he bring up these accents? I really don't know what to say. It must have been a funny mixture. In any event, it would have been, I think, alien and different to the accent of Lowland Scots, let alone Highland Scots who spoke English.
Yeah, so...
Not much of an answer, but...
No, but unlike Mary Queen of Scots, who was said about her that she spoke French with a lovely Scotch accent.
Right.
One thing about Charles worth remembering when speaking about how well he spoke languages and in what accent was that he was, of course, a really quite talented musician. He had a good ear, therefore, and that should have lent itself to him speaking English. Well, not necessarily with an English accent, but with an accent possibly quite like my son, who speaks perfect English, but because he was never brought up in England, no one can place his accent. You know that he speaks perfect English, but it isn't quite the English that you can identify with anything. When Edward and I have speculated on this in the past, we have thought that perhaps there might have been some form of what you could very generally call a Celtic element to it, but whether that was a lilt, whether that was an inflection of certain words, we really can't know. But he's certainly having a good musical ear, would have most probably had a very good ear for languages.
And that usually follows, doesn't it? The musical ability, a linguistic ability. Yes. That. Peter, turning to you and thinking about the character of Charles Edward and Henry Benedict and their father. I mean, are they all, you know, acorns that have fallen from the same tree? Are they different? What characterizes their individual personalities for you?
Well, perhaps the book's about Charles, so perhaps to focus on him, I certainly don't see him as being similar to his father. If we believe his father to be stoical, his father was capable of losing his temper, but it didn't happen very often at all, and he really had to be thoroughly provoked for that to happen. Whereas Charles, but equally, we know about James that we can see what happened in the 15. It's believed that James perhaps became ill through stress. One really doesn't know. The weather certainly wouldn't have been very good. But he certainly didn't have this extraordinary dynamism, this get up and go, this all or nothing aspect to his character that Charles had. And indeed, this all or nothing aspect to Charles's personality would have been the reason, I'm sure, which led to his alcoholism. You know, he so burnt himself out, in particular after the 45, doing everything he possibly could, possibly in not a very effective way, certainly not in a diplomatic way, but he threw himself into trying to rescue something from the 45, and you can see quite plainly it burnt him out. You can see that he reacted to that by engaging in two extraordinarily passionate love affairs, both interestingly enough with relations on his mother's Polish side. And then, of course, his alcoholism makes us think about his mother's illness from 1727 on right up until her death, which I certainly associate with anorexia. And both alcoholism and anorexia are often associated or grouped together by medical people who know about such things as being associated with an addictive personality, a brittle personality. And so when we see Charles, you know, with this tremendous dynamism, this charisma, where with a personality where when it's going well, you know, he shines. You know, he really becomes quite a genuine hero. And then it all collapses when he burns himself out, because with this brittle personality, he just pushed himself to the absolute limit, and he cracked, quite simply.
Yeah. That's very interesting, Peter. You mentioned his mother's situation. I mean, what is the relationship between them? Is there warmth? Is there affection? You know, are they kindred spirits?
Well, they both love music, but Edward will tell us that Charles's access to his mother was really quite limited, almost strictly limited, you know, when he was a very young person. But that the descriptions of how upset both Charles and Henry were when their mother died leaves us in little doubt as to what a strong bond they had with her. But then again, you know, assuming that I am right in calling Clementina's illness anorexia, something which I believe, I mean, that creates an extremely tense and stressful environment for those affected by it. But Edward, I would ask you perhaps to comment upon Charles's lack of access to his mother, which seems so unfair and perhaps was quite harmful to him.
Yes. I mean, Clementina is not well treated at the Stuart court. There's no doubt about that. And one of the reasons for this is that James shows great favoritism towards three Scottish Protestants. I've already mentioned James Murray, the Earl of Dunbar. The others are John Hay, the Jacobite Earl of Inverness, and his wife Marjorie. And it's quite clear that Lord and Lady Inverness and Lord Dunbar, when he is there, are not nice to the Queen at all. And when the prince is handed over prematurely at the age of 4.5 from women to men, and Lord Dunbar is put in charge, James makes it quite clear that the Queen may not see her son except in the presence of Lord Dunbar. Now, the Queen hated Lord Dunbar. Charles grew up also to hate Lord Dunbar. And so the stresses and strains of Charles's upbringing in relation to how his mother was treated and to what extent he was able to see her are very, very significant in the psychology of the young boy growing up.
Very interesting. The word bond's been used, and I wanted then to now look at, we've talked about this very international court, we've talked about the Britishness there. What about the Scottishness? Peter, how does Charles relate to the Scottish aspects of Jacobitism, and what triggers that affiliation? Are there any triggers? Is there a natural affinity there?
No, I think that's a very good point. I think the trigger came at the very end of the 1730s. One can almost feel that Charles was looking for a way to be different, to differentiate himself from his father, and frankly from his brother Henry. Henry's relationship with his father, well, I won't comment about the entirety of Henry's life, because there were moments after the 45 when there was some friction. But before the 45, the relationship between Henry and his father was very good. And at a certain point in 1739 and 1740, the Duke of Perth and his brother decided that they wanted to remind Charles that he wasn't just the heir after his father to the thrones of England and Ireland, but in particular to the ancient Stuart throne of Scotland. And to remind him, they did this by sending him basically, arms, armor, and various Scottish accoutrements, if I can just call it that. Even sheets of music, although they were aimed mainly at Henry, but both boys loved dancing, incidentally, and both boys were pretty good at it. Charles was particularly excellent at dancing. And this suddenly appeared, let's say, on as a gift on Charles's tabletop. And one of the first things he does is appear dressed as a Scot, dressed in Scottish in Scottish attire. I'm not sure if it wasn't even 3 balls, but certainly 2 balls given in Rome. And the tartan and the clothes really created quite a sensation. He wrote back, and I think the phrase is quite important, using the phrase in thanking the purse. He used the phrase, "I can now dress as my friends do." And from that moment onwards, we also begin to see in his portraiture being shown far more clearly the Order of St. Andrew, which hadn't always appeared, and sometimes hadn't appeared at all in earlier portraiture. Edward, I don't know if you want to comment on what I've just said.
Yes, I agree. If you just take that last point, I mean, the Stuarts wore the thistle as well as the garter. And as time goes by, the thistle becomes less evident in the portraits of Prince Charles, just as you have said, until finally it disappears altogether. And I think there is a feeling among the Scots that, hang on, we've got to do something to make him identify with Scotland. And this, again, I'm picking up on what you said. James was always the King of England. In France, in Rome, he was the King of England. He was not the King of Great Britain. I mean, it was known he was the King of Scotland and Ireland, but he was always referred to as King of England, even by the Scots. So I think Charles is seeing a way of becoming different, developing his own personality and saying, right, I am going to be the future King of Scotland, and I'm going to identify with Scotland. And then the fact that the Duke of Perth gives these specifically Highland weapons stimulates him immensely. I once thought that because of the favouritism and the hostility of Lord Inverness and Lord Dunbar, Charles might even have been, a little bit less enamoured of the Scots during the early 1730s. But the Scottish community at the court was itself divided, so that the Scottish Catholics and the Scottish Protestants at the court were deeply hostile to Lord Inverness and Lord Dunbar. So I couldn't say that Charles has been anti-Scottish and suddenly becomes pro-Scottish. It is more a matter of identifying so positively in something which seems to mark him out as different from his father.
And then thinking about that, clearly the final denouement is on the windswept Mossy Moor. I mean, they don't relaunch another attempt to take the throne. Peter, any thoughts on that? What happens after then? And we hear of these clandestine visits to Great Britain and conversions to Anglicanism. Any thoughts on these years after Culloden?
Well, there was no lack of effort on Charles's part in the 1740s after the 45 when he was in France. It was far more that his personality was far too impatient to wait for the appropriate moment. The politics, without going into detail, was simply not there for the French to relaunch another invasion. And without the French, really very little could possibly happen. Charles, it's easy to forget how young Charles was. In 1740, he was born at the very end of 1720, and therefore it was only at the end of 1745 that he actually was 25 years old. So as a very young man, he's without any real political experience. He jumps up and down and beats his breast and castigates and threatens and puts on various performances to try and coerce his cousin, after all, the King of France, to try and do something. But no, it just simply doesn't happen. As I mentioned earlier, he then finds presumably some outlet for his extraordinary frustration in the form of two passionate love affairs. But then finally, as you move into the 1750s, he's already now become an alcoholic. I won't go into detail now, but I think it is important, and my book does try and draw a distinction with regard to what sort of an alcoholic he was. Not all alcoholics are the same. There were long periods of time when Charles didn't drink, but it was the re-emergence of stress which always was the trigger for him to go to revert to what his brother Henry once described very appropriately as the nasty bottle. So not only were the politics not appropriate immediately after the 45, but then later on, when there were moments when the politics were more appropriate, Charles himself was no longer really a person who was capable of leading anything.
That's interesting, picking up on that, Peter, and maybe for you both, the question of his personality, of his leadership ability. Was he an attractive person? Did they feel led by him? Did they feel inspired by him? Was he a nice guy?
Well, I don't know if he was a nice guy or not. He could be charming. He had charisma. He couldn't possibly have landed in Scotland with so few people and actually come remarkably close to pulling off a victory. So if we say, was he nice? I would say, I don't know. He was capable of great charm. He was certainly charismatic, but equally, and of course, where alcohol's involved, all sorts of elements of the character just go wrong. He certainly treated very badly some people who were very close to him, not least his own daughter, not least her mother, Clementina Walkinshaw. But if we then say, so indeed, what did go wrong? What were the key elements of Charles's failure? Well, I would say, first of all, he lacked military experience. And why did he lack military experience? He lacked military experience because it was a deliberate Hanoverian policy to keep him from gaining military experience. Secondly, the Highland Army, the army that was assembled, was unlike the Hanoverian army. It wasn't one which had a single commander at the very top, who, if he issued an order, that went. Charles was a young man. He had clan chiefs. He had other military people. There was a war council. He couldn't dictate what he wanted to do. Charles, without doubt, wanted to press on at Derby, and that didn't guarantee success. But the war council took the decision to retreat from Derby, and that did guarantee failure. Then I think there are two other things. There's the question of Charles's attitude towards religion. This is an incredibly subtle question, because this is to do with the Vatican support, this is to do with the French support, and the French military support was crucial. So any moment at which to make a change to Protestantism was fraught with all sorts of dangers, but it was crucial to do, and it was probably crucial to get right. But at least equally important was something which, in my opinion, Charles didn't seem to appreciate. I'm not sure his father appreciated. I'm not sure that anyone, let's say, educated the Stuarts with regard to this. And this was as follows. It was true the Hanoverians were deeply unpopular, but it was not true that constitutional monarchy was deeply unpopular. And that isn't the same thing. Whereas the Stuarts did not see themselves as potential constitutional monarchs. And that is a really important issue here. Constitutional monarchy, the limits on the monarch's power, were not unpopular in Scotland. So we must differentiate that. And I'm quite certain that this also lay at the foundation. This was one of the elements that lay at the foundation of Charles's failure.
Right. So the sort of absolutism being in the DNA, but the Scots, the way the British public are looking for monarchy, but a kind of a more modern version. Just thinking, I mean, there's been so much work's gone into this, Peter, and you know, is this work ongoing for you? Are there more discoveries to be made? Are there more paintings in private collections? Will we see a second edition, you know, in 3 or 4 years down the line?
I'm sure Edward will agree with me. I'm sure you know this yourself. That every time you finish a book, if you know that by definition there's going to be more elements of interest, perhaps more pieces of evidence which you'll discover in the future, and you try and publish a book at the point at which you think you've understood, let's say, at least enough to warrant publishing the book. So if you want to discover what it is you've missed, publish the book, and almost immediately you will discover what it is that you did miss, because it'll crawl out of the wood.
It'll pop up.
Always will. Yes.
Exactly. Well, in my particular case, there's one element that I wish I would have written more about. I mentioned a very important person called Bishop Giorgio Lascaris. Bishop Giorgio Lascaris essentially became a person an extremely close confidant of King James and also of Cardinal Henry. And for a long period of time, I knew that. What I hadn't realized was that he spent 10 years before the 45 in Lwów, in southeastern Poland. And not only was he there, but when he was there, he became extremely good friends with the Princes Radziwiłł, who were the Stuarts' closest Polish cousins. They were related to the Stuarts through the Sobieskis. The Radziwiłłs were descended from King John Sobieski's sister. But he was also there because he was a Theatine. And one of the jobs, or one of the areas of interest for the Theatines was the Polish-Armenian community that was based in Lvov, and the fact that they were in union with Rome. So he spent 10 years alongside the Radzivills, and also having to do as closely as possible with the Polish-Armenian community, and central at the very apex of that community was the family Nikorovich, which was the family into whom Charlotte Stuart's firstborn daughter, Victoire, married. And that is, things like that are not coincidences. That was quite an important point. I would have liked to have focused a little bit more on that, but shortly I'll be publishing a very short article about this, so that at least it's recorded somewhere else.
Peter, Edward, it's been an absolute pleasure as ever to chat Jacobite Stuarts with you, to consider this lovely new publication, this thoroughly researched, really a beautiful book to look at as well. You know, these lovely portraits, but it's the kernels of the research that's gone into this that really make it a really good read. And I do hope that everybody does try and secure a copy of Bonnie Prince Charlie, His Family Legend by Peter Brodinski. Edward, Peter, you both very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave.